So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome everybody today to our fourth masterclass of this digital capitalism course. My name is Sofia Scasserra. I am a researcher at TNI, at the Transnational Institute, and we are really happy to be here to introduce ourselves in this topic that is the digital trade agenda. So far, we have had a lot of feedback in the first three masterclasses. We thank you very much for your participation, as your questions and comments have generated very valuable exchanges. Unfortunately, we cannot individually answer all of them, but we hope that along with the weekly digest that we send every week, our answers in the forum and the masterclasses, that you get a better understanding of the issue we are exploring. In line with our second week, the masterclass that we had on the second week, the Make Amazon Pay campaign has asked us to sign a petition calling to Amazon to sign on to the International Accord for Health and Safety in the Textile and Garment Industry Agreement that it was made after the Rana Plaza massacre in Bangladesh, where more than 1,100 garment workers died after a garment workshop building collapsed in the year 2013. If you wish to sign the petition, please click on the link in the chat box. Now, our fourth week has started. We are so excited about it, also because the question about international governance and rules for the digital sphere came up several times during the course, the forums, and in the Q&As in the masterclasses. So we have some course partners that are helping us putting up this course, IT for Change, SOMO, Statewatch. They are organizing this course with us, helping us with some unit. We are a group of people, Nick, Sofia, me, well, myself, Pia, Jess, Jory, Guillermo. I just wanted to introduce you to them because we are the people behind all this collective effort that we're doing. So this week's module is digital trade. And you have seen the course program so far. We have done 3 units. This is our 4th unit. And now you have some, for this unit, you have, you have quizzes, you have the readings, you have further materials, you have videos, and you have a very fun game to play with tiles at the end of the week. So you can test yourself whether if you understood the classes of digital trade or not, or whether you need to do more further reading. So that's what we try to do to make it more fun. Our goal in this session today is to complement the materials you will have read in the course and also allow you to ask questions from experts in the field. You can ask your question throughout the session via the Q&A button and the bottom of the screen. Throughout the session, we'll be sharing links to resources, further reading in the chat box. We also know that there is a lot of knowledge among attendees, so feel free to share your thoughts and links too. Now, digital trade presents itself as boring, technical issue that has nothing to do with daily life. The truth is that trade negotiators talk about digital trade rules as if they are merely e-commerce rules to make us think that it's all about selling goods and services online, but there's much more than that. The digital trade rules are the attempt of big tech to legally lock their business model because they know that much can be done by governments to hinder their profit making. Taxes, regulation, data governance, data commons, global rules to make them accountable are all actions that states can and should urgently take. This week, we show you a couple of statements about digital trade and data. And you could tell us how much you agree with the statements as a result so far. These statements were designed to make us all think about data and what role it has on global trade. As you all can see, in some of them, there are clear agreements, and in others, you are doubting as much as we do. So we talk about trade and what it means for digitalization. We have 3 amazing experts from whom we're going to learn a lot. And I'm even more happy because it's an all-women panel. So this is really important for us. And our first speaker, I'm going to introduce first speakers, and then we'll come to the questions and to the conversation, is Kristina Irion. She's an associate professor at the Institute of Information Law in the University of Amsterdam. She's a member of the Scientific Committee of the Annual Computer Privacy and Data Protection, International Conferences and International Advisory Board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Her research focused on the governance of transnational digital technologies and global data value chains from the perspective of European law and international economic law. Then I have the pleasure of presenting Vahini Naidu. She is the program coordinator of the Trade and Development Program at the South Center. Prior to joining the South Center, she was an international trade negotiator from the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, covering regional and multilateral trade negotiations. Her trade negotiating areas included trade in services, e-commerce, and the digital economy, development, and special and differential treatment, domestic regulation, and rules of origins in services. She was a diplomat in the South African permanent missions to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. She holds a Bachelor of Law degree from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a Master's of Commerce degree from the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business. And last but not least, I will introduce my dear friend and colleague, Deborah James. She's the Director of International Programs of the Center of Economic and Policy Research and coordinates the global network Our World is Not for Sale. Deborah James has over 20 years of experience working on issues of trade and democratic global governance. At the CEPR, her work focuses on World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the US policy towards Latin America. She is the author of the European Union's Digital Trade Rules Undermining European Policy to Rein the Big Tech, material which you have available in the further reading section of our Moodle. So for this first session, we want to let our speakers give us the input of their experience and knowledge. So as we start the conversation, to add your questions to the Q&A, so we're starting first with Deborah. So please, Deborah, could you tell us in 5 minutes, really short, and I'm going to start being really trying to stay strict with time, why trade rules matter? Why should we care about trade?
Thank you so much, Sofia, and thanks to TNI and the other co-organizers and also my co-panelists from whom I've learned so much over these years. We actually have to pay attention to trade policy, obviously, because technology is not neutral. Who benefits from technology will depend mostly on who sets the policy under which it's operated. And obviously, we mostly agree that that technology and digitalization should promote improvement for human rights, improvement for our environment, improvement for our labor aspirations, our shared prosperity. But the reality is that today, the digital divide is narrowing in terms of who has access to technology, but the digital economic gap is actually widening. And that means that digitalization is actually contributing to the exacerbation of inequality, both within countries and between countries today. And that's partially because at this point, data is de facto controlled by whoever extracts it, which is, foreign big corporations, big tech. And that's not how it has to be. That's a policy design that we've allowed to happen and that can be changed. And so we need policies that ensure that digitalization benefits the poorest, that it promotes development, that its benefits are broadly shared and not monopolized, and that is through digital industrialization policies. And we need to ensure that digitalization benefits humanity, respects human rights, and that is through the public regulation of digitalization or the use of data for the public good. Now, what happens is that corporations use trade agreements to actually get the rules that they want in the global economy, to rig the economy in their favor. And they do this to get rules that they could never get under democracy. Okay, so they want to maintain monopolies. They don't want to pay taxes. They want to exploit workers. They want to evade regulations. These are things that we all know corporations are doing all of the time. And what they do is that they use trade agreements to go around the democratic process and to lock these type of rules into a global agreement. Okay, so it's really important to understand that trade rules are rights to trade. And those rights are exercised by corporations, okay? There's no new rights for individuals. There's no new rights for consumers or for workers or even for governments under trade agreements. Trade rules also limit ways that governments can regulate foreign corporations in their own country. So they put handcuffs on governments. Okay, they limit the amount of regulation that governments can do on foreign corporations. They put no new obligations on corporations, okay? So it's always limiting governments and giving more power to corporations and not actually having anything to do with things like human rights or labor or the environment, which are generally prohibited in trade agreements, with small exceptions. And trade is generally the least democratic form of policymaking, and we can talk about why. We can only really bring about digital industrialization and the use of data for the public good in order to enjoy shared prosperity from digitalization that respects human rights, that respects ecological realities, if we don't have the handcuffs of trade agreements. And this is by design, right? Because everything imagine that corporations have tons of money to spend on lawyers to imagine ways to rig the global economy in their favor by doing all the things that we just talked about. And they do this through trade agreements, partially because it's one of the least democratic forms of decision-making, because trade negotiators are often beholden specifically to corporations more than they allow input from other sectors. And we could talk more about that. And also because trade agreements are binding permanent treaties. This is another reason why corporations love them. You can change your government. You can get rid of corrupt leadership. You can have a change. But if you have a treaty, especially in an institution like the WTO, which has 166 members, it is very difficult to amend that treaty when you later see that you need more policy space for more fair governance. So in effect, those are a couple of the reasons why corporations use trade to rig the economy in their favor, and why we who are looking at digitalization need to pay attention to the fact that they are doing this both through bilateral and regional agreements, as well as through the World Trade Organization globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for being really, really tight with time. Now to you, Kristina. So also in 5 minutes, how would you define digital trade rules in the capitalist system? What do these rules imply from a systemic point of view?
So thank you, Sofia, for your question, and welcome to all the participants here in the chat. I'm also happy to contribute. I'm an academic, so I'm mostly fascinated to see how international trade law has become digital trade law, where that comes from, what the effects are. And I have studied that by coincidence, actually, because a couple of years ago, the European Consumer Rights Organization, BERG, they were wondering about a new clause on free data flows in trade agreement draft texts. And they asked me as a data protection scholar, Kristina, can you look at it and how does this free data clause, if at all, may conflict with our data protection regulatory framework in that we have in the European Union? And this was when it was like an eye-opener for me at this moment, because I realized that digital trade really moves into regulatory aspects that countries have in the context of the digitalization and digital transformation of society, such as data protection, but also other regulatory domains, and that it can actually have an impact and create conflict between these regulatory domains. So how did that happen? Originally, I mean, first of all, trade is nothing bad, and also international trade law has a reason why it exists. It is supposed to create agreement between countries about how they want to exchange goods and services, and also remove barriers to trade. And in principle, this is not a bad idea to smooth things down and have a fruitful international economy. So when I'm saying all this now, I'm not conceptually anti-trade. Yeah, you can be pro-trade, you can be pro many digital services and things, but you can disagree with certain ways how digital trade is now at the moment developed and in what direction it goes. So in the course of this research, and also looking at other scholars who have already done work on this, I discovered that this whole digital trade agenda goes back to the Clinton administration era in the US, where they basically created a shopping list of what they considered digital trade barriers, and everything that didn't exactly fit the US context was then quickly labeled a protectionist or digital trade barrier. And this is how digital trade requirements have become institutionalized and have been traveling into negotiations around the world. And that is how it was also becoming substance into the first digital trade chapter that was concluded, such as, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Then the US has withdrawn from that partnership, and it became the comprehensive and economic TPP, CPTPP, which is still in effect and connects many countries of the Pacific Ring, and where these rules have become institutionalized and binding. What is also interesting is that the whole discussion about digital trade started off with electronic commerce. Electronic commerce is a much more narrow notion than digital trade. Electronic commerce means that you can mail order things, that you can contract services online and then use them. Whereas digital trade actually makes that much more bigger and supports whole business models that are thriving on the digital environment. The whole digital platform ecosystem, for example, would be digital trade. So it is a much, much larger notion. And there is also something about this group of people that are engaging in digital trade, the trade negotiators, and those which are working in these environment, because I think they are very particularly socialized. And they are also dealing with each other in these circles where they are perceiving trade as the utmost objective of their professional activity, and they are trying to create rules that are leading in the digital economy, and sometimes they are not very conscious of rules that already exist and that have grown inside different countries and regions to tackle certain things. So what was for me very important to realize is that, first of all, of course, these digital trade rules, they can be questioned. You have to ask why. Why do we need that? Where's the problem? The second issue that is important to realize is that digital trade rules are not always making things better, because data flows exist already. They have existed before digital trade rules, and they will probably also continue to exist after them. And we also have to ask, what is the price that economies and countries and citizens have to give in for concluding such an agreement? And how are we able to also preserve local and traditional situations and take account of that? One good and very, very instructive example has been a judgment by the so-called Waitangi Tribunal from New Zealand that preserves the interests and the cultural rights of the population, the Maori people in New Zealand vis-a-vis the New Zealand government. And they had to assess this big treaty that I just mentioned earlier, the CPTPP, and they were assessing whether the digital trade chapter actually respects the rights of the Maori people. And I found that a very, very instructive judgment, because it was saying essentially that it is not clear, it is difficult to interpret these rules, it is difficult to say with sufficient amount of certainties how these rules would unpack in a trade dispute. And this is why this Waitangi Tribunal says that the government of New Zealand was not doing enough to protect the interests of the Maori people and has to improve. And indeed, also New Zealand has slowly adopted its stance in digital trade rules and now protects the interests of Maori people more intensively. Now, the point is what the Maori people rights and interests means is the same also for other people. You don't need to be a minority or part of a particular ethnic group in order to have the same interests. It is about personal data, it is about accountability, and it is about the ability as individuals to also have access to justice and to remedies in the context of digital systems and algorithms. And later in this talk, I will show you a little more about that.
Thank you, Kristina. It's really interesting what you pose, because it is true that it makes no sense to be against trade. And the fact that we make rules is to come to an agreement in order to improve trade, that we all know that the world and the economy benefits greatly from trade. I mean, it would be a crazy thing to lock yourself into your country and not to trade goods and services. And the way they're designed, the rules, they boost the trade towards in favor of corporations, or they leave some policy space for state to be able to shape their own economy. So that's what we really need to ask ourselves, how we're shaping those rules and what kinds of standards we're posing, so countries come to an agreement, but they are able to protect the rights of their people. So now to Vahini, also in 5 minutes, I want to ask you, as a person that worked for the South African government and that have been involved in the negotiations, is there a colonialist perspective or dimension to these negotiations? What's your look around the fact that some rules are imposed by some countries and other countries must follow, or is there a way of influencing the negotiations?
Yes, thank you so much, Sofia, and good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. Simply put, I think if we kind of put everything into perspective, and we look at the kinds of rules that are being proposed, and if we track who is advancing them, it was just pointed out that they had initially started out as e-commerce rules, but they have now expanded to digital trade rules, and they pretty much cover the entire scope of the digital economy. And the vehicle that is being used to capture and lock in the ability for countries to expand and develop in the digital economy is through trade agreements and free trade agreements. And so within this context, I would have to say that, yes, a strong case can be made that there is a very large colonialist perspective to trade agreements incorporating digital trade rules. So this is in the context, for example, in the joint statement initiative on e-commerce. So this is kind of an agreement that is being championed by a subset of countries along the sidelines of the WTO. So you might hear me say the JSI on e-commerce, and so this is the agreement that I'm referring to. But if you also look at the kinds of rules that are being proposed, negotiated, formulated, adopted by governments, not only in the sidelines of the WTO, but also through bilateral free trade agreements, and also in regional perspectives. For example, the most recent case would be the African Continental FTA on the Digital Trade Protocol. It's very clear that these rules are serving one particular purpose, and that is to advance a very mercantilist approach and not a very pro-development digital industrialization approach. And so, Deborah had made a very important point about these agreements, is that once you sign it, at least from the experience that we've seen in the WTO, it has been that it is extremely hard to review these agreements, even though you could build in review provisions, but also it's very, very difficult to revisit these kinds of agreements once it's been given up or once it's been adopted. But some examples that I would like to just briefly point out with respect.
Sorry to interrupt you. Do you have your camera on? Because we can't see you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, I forgot.
Okay, thank you.
Can you see me?
With examples.
Okay, great. Yeah, and so some examples that I wanted to point out was the notion that we're seeing big technology firms having a very large influence in trade negotiations. But this is from the perspective of not only influencing governments, but they're also largely investing in academic and policy research to advance their interests. So this is coming out quite prominently in the AI space as well. So this is something that is very concerning. We're also seeing a major concentration of power, and of course, in economic terms, first mover advantage, meaning that if you already have a large export interest, for example, then your chances of continuing to dominate a particular space is much more. You would succeed, primarily because you already have a lot of the infrastructure in place, and we're seeing this take place across a number of developing countries. But a very key issue that we're seeing, enter trade agreements is the notion of data flows. And this is taking various forms, but primarily the intention behind it is essentially the control of data. So one of the terms that has been used a lot has been data colonialism, that is being kind of entrenched into these new age trade agreements. And essentially, the kind of the background behind this is that because data is a key asset in the digital economy, a lot of firms are trying to lock in the ability for countries to either regulate or create data governance frameworks in which their own companies and firms could potentially monetize and capitalize on some of the benefits, while also ensuring that there is a large degree of privacy and protection safeguards with respect to data. And finally, I think, to kind of sum up the notion of this data or this digital colonialism, I would also want to add that we are increasingly seeing across a number of fora. So this is in the UN through the negotiations on the Global Digital Compact. We're seeing it in the WTO. We're seeing it in the African Continental FTA as well, is the ability of countries to participate in the negotiations is extremely limited. This is from implementation capacity of actual trade rules, but it's also in terms of your capacity to develop rules, to propose rules, and also bearing in mind, as a former trade negotiator, we were trained the old school way to deal with traditional trade issues. And so when you look at digital issues, these are really internet governance issues in which trade ministries are not necessarily the line function ministries that have the necessary expertise to deal with this. So it also requires a high degree of coordination with multiple ministries in order for trade, for example, to take the lead in these negotiations. And so this is quite an important loophole, I guess, and a big challenge that we're seeing in the digital trade negotiations, in which very complex, very technical issues do not get the necessary expertise because the different ministries are covering them, and also sometimes the expertise is simply not there. So I'll stop here, and I'll look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vahini. It's really interesting that, and it's also true that these are all internet governance issues, and trade negotiators should not be dealing with this. This should be dealt in some other fora, like the UN or another place, not trade. This is not an economic thing only, but it's more broad, like the discussion. Now that we have seen the broad pictures of the negotiations, like this first round of questions was trying to get a broad picture of what is going on, I want to try to deep dive into the topic. So Kristina, the first question is to you, and I would like to know how digital trade rules are assessed by academics. Could you explain with the help of examples, like how do you address these type of issues?
So if everything works well, you can see my screen. And I want to talk.
We do. Maybe you can open up because we see all the PowerPoint things around. So maybe you can present.
Yes.
That's perfect.
So wonderful. So first of all, I can only support the previous speaker, because it is true that digital trade somehow made headway in the way how countries approach international digital issues, because digital trade has an advantage in the way that it can be more easily negotiated, as also Deborah said earlier, because it is negotiations between countries that are often secret, without civil society or other democratic representation, and thereby it creates opportunity structures that are conducive to coming to an agreement that maybe have not been the same way when we think about the internet governance fora that we have entertained before. But it also means that it is, of course, creating an opportunity structure that is not always conducive to all the interests and rights. And this is why digital trade can be seen quite critically. Now, I want to quickly brush you up on how to read digital trade agreements or trade agreements in general. And this is something that has to be done in 3 steps. You basically start looking at a trade agreement, and you look whether a particular activity or a particular cross-border supply of a service is within the scope. This has to be done by looking, are these the right parties to the agreement, which sector is covered in the agreement, and what have the countries committed to in their schedules and in their reservations. If they inscribe the reservation for a particular sector, which they can do, then this activity is not covered. For example, traditionally, the European Union makes exceptions and reservations for audiovisual media sector, but we also know other exceptions and reservations that are often coming from a long practice in trade law. And that also shows that it is possible to have reservations, if you just want it strongly enough. After that, you have to focus on the rule. There are specific rules in digital trade law. I have studied 2 different rules, especially the cross-border movement of information or data, which is often framed as free or global data flow commitments. And another one that I have studied is the prohibition to require access or transfer of source code of software. So when you look at the rule, you have to basically see what measures it covers, what definitions it uses, if any, what terms, how would they be interpreted under using international interpretation of treaty rules, and whether this then would qualify, this measure would then qualify as an infringement of this rule. If the measure infringes the rule, then we call that a violation of the trade law commitment, and this violation can then still be exempted or justified. And then there are 2 different types of exceptions usually inscribed in trade agreements. Some of these exceptions are directly attached to a specific prohibition or rule. So, for example, if we look at the source code of software clauses, then there is an exception specifically inscribed for court procedures or for competition law authorities investigations. So that would then counterbalance the commitment, and such a measure would still be okay also under this trade law agreement. Then there are the general exceptions. These are exceptions that are designed as a horizontal exception for general interest measures like public policy, but they are conditioned, and these conditions are rather heavy to meet, because that is a very trade law friendly, let's say, exception that cannot be leveraged easily by the countries that want to invoke it. And finally, there's the security exception that is also kind of standard luggage in such international trade law agreements. And they are often self-judging or require very little justification, which then makes one wonder why general interest regulation has such heavy justification requirements, but public or national security can simply be invoked, and then you have a free pass. It also is often used by countries more extensively. For example, the US has a very wide approach to national security, and yes, also economic interests can be national security relevant, and then you can rely on this exception quite easily, but those countries that are using the general exceptions have it more difficult. So after having said that, the result is a donut, yes, but it is a good way of thinking about the problem here. The donut analogy is actually trying to show you what level or what margin of discretion is still left for countries when they want to regulate digital, or when they want to make digital regulations, such as data protection laws, such as consumer protection laws, non-discrimination laws, and so on. Because trade law is kind of the dough of the donut around a certain public interest, and it conditions what you can do. And only the little hole in the middle of the donut is this margin of maneuver that is left for the countries to pass domestic regulation. If domestic regulation is getting too big and kind of starts touching the dough, then trade law would actually be available as a means to try to push back on that country's domestic regulation. But what you don't see with the donut example is that there's also a sort of preemptive effect on public policy that comes from these trade law negotiations, because we are starting to build up certain narratives in public policy or domestic regulation. And these narratives can be really quite leading and influential. So, for example, when you hear the claim that free data flows or free flow of data is good, then you would also think that, of course, this is a very positive policy objective. Yes, of course, who doesn't agree with free data flows, freedom of speech, and so on. But at the same time, if you think about it closely, free data flows is not always good. We do not want foreign interference with election campaigns. We don't want mis and disinformation. We don't want cybersecurity dangerous code infiltrating our system. So it is actually a misleading simplification to think about free data flows in this kind of breadth and without clearly specifying in what context is it good, it is good. In what kind of free data flows we really need. It is oversimplifying, and it is often even out of sync sometimes with the state of technology. For example, today it is really, really difficult to move super large amounts of data collections between geographic locations. This is often taking a lot of time, there's latency, and it also requires a lot of energy. Actually, it's much more easy now to move the code or the algorithm to where the data resides, and you can still work with it. So in a way, by thinking about free data flows being a trade law disciplines, we are also enshrining not always the technical state of the art anymore, but we are living in a time when everything had to flow to function, yeah? Another example I brought is the source code of software example that is inscribed in many digital trade law chapters today. This provision says that source code of software should not be required as a condition for market access by the government of a country. And when you think about it, then you also understand, of course, that source code can embody commercially valuable information, and that there are reasons why this should not be extracted as a condition for entering a certain market. However, when you think about it more closely in the long run, then sometimes it will be necessary to also have access to source code of software. For example, if delivery drivers are when their whole labor conditions are determined by the source code of a platform like Uber or some other delivery service, then these workers will need to have access to source code to determine actually if a cancellation or their payment rewards are actually fair and non-discriminatory. The same applies if you think about bookings that you make online for hotels or flights. How will you ever find out if this is fair and if you have not been discriminated, even economically discriminated as a consumer? And there are so many more examples why source code of software cannot be absolutely off limits for regulators and for also NGOs and critical engineers, academics like me and others. Because if we are not able to engage and scrutinize code, then how can we ever find out if this code is actually a fair and accountable practice in the digital economy? So in a way, I try to suggest that this donut that is created by digital trade law is often not doing justice to the challenges we face today. And a number of leading scholars of international trade law have recently also made statements that say, for us, the challenges that come with digitalization of society, economy, work, and all other sectors, education of society, they are so new that nobody has actually ready solutions. We have to be able to experiment a bit. We have to be able to also see how countries that adopt different solutions, how they fare in tackling societal problems that come with digitalizations. And they are very grave ones, like, for example, the issue of mis and disinformation that can tear apart the trust in democratic institutions and also elections. So we must be able to also adopt regulation that is adequate in light of the problem at hand, and not just adequate in light of the digital trade law donut that is created by these agreements. So you may have heard that also recently the US has withdrawn its support at the WTO negotiations that have been mentioned by Vahini previously, the so-called Joint Statement Initiative. So there is for the moment a little bit of a reset. We are able to actually hear and discuss different arguments than the discourse that has been in place before, that everything has to conform to this digital trade standards. But of course, we should also have no illusions that this is going to be off the table. In fact, there are many other countries that are proliferating this kind of digital trade standards, like free data flows and source code of software in their bilateral trade agreements or in other regional trade agreements, like we have heard also from Vahini before in Africa. And I also would like to mention that we don't know who will be the next government in the US. So it can be that we are defaulting back to these digital trade rules as well. Also, the European Union, I should mention, is rather uncritical about these digital trade rules by basically saying that they have strong regulations in place and that they have assessed the consistency between digital trade rules and their domestic regulation, and that they are convinced that this is all taken care of and that we should simply trust that digital trade law will not limit the scope of maneuver for the regulators in the EU. Well, I sometimes think this is an overstated confidence in the ability to foresee all these ramifications that can happen with digital trade law and possible dispute resolution that invites a different jurisdiction, a body of basically trade law socialized experts to judge on a particular clause, and that these experts may actually adopt definitions and notions and reason in a way that would then override what has been presented by one of the countries that says that there is domestic regulation that was found to violate digital trade law. So I would actually caution, I would say that one of our problems here is that we are thinking too narrow about the exceptions, that the general exceptions for public interest regulation have been in the past not very solid to deliver exceptions and to deliver justifications in a trade law dispute, also because they have been, they are quite stringent in the way how they can be applied and invoked. And I also think that the way how these digital trade rules try to generate very broad rules, like very broad, like all data should flow free, or all software source code should be protected, that this is not adequate in light of the challenges that we have at hand and the reality that we need to regulate some or protect certain types of data, like health data, for example, that is highly sensitive, but also data that should be then protected and kept maybe locally in countries. Not all data localization measures are necessarily bad, and that also source code of software is already protected by many other regimes, like, for example, trade secret law, that actually makes it questionable if we need this extra layer of protection that comes by digital trade law. So I am more of a critical scholar here, and I think that some of these clauses are too broad, the exceptions too narrow, and the way how they would be entering our international law would make them very difficult to meet the challenges of creating a safe and accountable digital society.
Thank you, Kristina. I love the idea of the donut. It's really an image that it's really powerful on how trade law works. And it kind of makes me think your presentation, how we are creating our own spaghetti bowl of digital trade rules. So for our audience, the spaghetti bowl was a term used for free trade agreements and free trade law all around, that it was so complicated, and we have so bilaterals, multilaterals, plurilaterals agreements, that it was kind of a spaghetti bowl that we didn't know which rule to apply to which situation. And we're kind of like creating our own digital spaghetti bowl, it makes me think, with all what you presented. So now to Deborah, what does all this implies to workers, citizens, and the environment in general? You have done great deal of research around that, around the impacts and how it will affect our daily lives. So we want to hear about that.
Thank you so much, Sofia. So we have an extensive amount of analysis, particularly about how these digital trade rules would affect development and workers and people in developing countries. And that is on our website at ourworldisnotforsale.net. And I really invite you all to spend some time there and seeing some of these incredible papers that have been produced by our network over the last years, analyzing some of these. There is one paper that actually looks at these issues in particular with regards to Europe. And that's one that I did last year. So I'm going to put that in the chat. So this really, it's so important what Kristina said, that this is not only an economic issue, right? These are internet governance issues. They have to do with human rights implications. They have implications for the environment. They have implications for labor, for workers. And all of these constituencies and all of these goals are actually not contemplated when trade negotiators sit down and try to write an agreement. And so rather than going through provision by provision, which I think can get a little bit technical and maybe not so interesting, I'd like to posit that those of you, and including those of you who say, well, I'm not a trade person, I don't work on trade, you actually know a lot about what these corporations are doing because you live in the real world. And so what I'm going to suggest is actually that it's more interesting and more useful to look at what is the business model of these corporations, because you see their business model being enacted every day in the real world. And then we can look at the implications of what the provisions are based on how it's affecting their business model. And that I think is more illuminative because it's based in your reality as people. So what are some of the things that big tech, when big tech sits down and says, hey, lawyers, let's get together and figure out ways where we can rig the economy so that we can have more power and profit. And then we'll suggest these to the trade negotiators as if they're trade agreement rules, because that's how we get them through a binding international treaty, okay? What is the model that they're trying to lock in? Well, they want market access rights. What does that mean? It means the right to participate in a market of a foreign country without restrictions under their own rules, right? So with equal or better conditions than local firms have, right? That's called national treatment in the WTO and in other trade agreements, but they want the right to be able to participate. So even if a country says, I'm not sure if that product or service is really what we need, the corporation can assert that it has a right to be there in your country selling these products. Now, they want not to have to pay taxes, right? Everybody knows that corporations are super awesome at not paying taxes, and digital firms have brought this to a new level, right? By hiding their data and putting different operations and then having the majority of their benefits be from licensing and things like that. So that's another core thing that we're going to see. They want to lock in deregulation. So they don't want to have regulations be applying to them. They don't want countries to be able to regulate in their sector as least as possible, right? They fight tooth and nail any kind of public interest regulation that they see that would cost them a little bit of money, and they want to lock in the deregulation that they already have. What else? They also want to not be accountable to the community in any way. So if they break laws, if they harm people, oh, we dumped a bunch of toxic waste in your backyard, or we actually allowed a whole bunch of, pro-suicide images to come through your daughter's Facebook feed and she killed herself. It's not our fault, right? So they want to not be held responsible for harms. This is a big part of the digital trade agreement, if you can imagine. They also want access to an infinite supply of cheap labor that is stripped of its rights, right? So they recreated this whole gig economy thing, saying that there's new labor laws, that the old labor laws don't apply, et cetera, et cetera. And now these are things you might say that all corporations do, right? But the big tech corporations are doing them in an even worse way because of taking advantage of digitalization to doing them. But they also have a sixth aspect, and that is control of the data. So they want to be able to control the data of consumers, of workers, of everything, okay? So it's really important, and this goes back to one thing that Kristina mentioned about the purpose of trade agreements. The purpose of a digital trade agreement is not to promote shared prosperity through trade and digitalized products, right? That's kind of the rhetoric that they use, that if we have a digital trade agreement, that digital trade is growing, and so we want the benefits to go to everybody, and so therefore you should sign a digital trade agreement. That actually is a logical fallacy. You can have digital trade be growing and actually have a digital trade agreement that the purpose of which is to funnel the profits and power to the people who came up with the ideas for the provisions of the agreement, right? It's not to make life better for you and me. So it's to achieve, the purpose is to achieve for corporations the above, and then to prevent states from being able to engage in digital industrialization, from being able to regulate digitalization in the public interest, so to apply labor law, to ensure anti-discrimination, to hold corporations accountable for harm caused, to ensure community benefits, and to be able to use data in the public interest. They want to keep the data private and not in the public interest, okay? So this is really important to understand the purpose of why these corporations have come up with the agreement. Now, for specific implications, for workers, okay, and I'm going to talk about workers as a class of people, not only like the individual atomized worker in an individual workplace, right? Because when we talk as workers, we have the ability to impact our situation vis-a-vis collective bargaining agreements that we do on the individual level with the employer. We have that ability to impact the labor laws that we operate under in terms of regulations that the state does. But sometimes groups of workers forget that there's also like the supranational structure of a trade agreement that actually sets the rules for the global economy. And that also impacts your rights and your status and who is actually benefiting from the economy when we're talking about international trade, okay? So one of the most important things to understand for impacts on workers is that the proposed rules are intended to consolidate the increased power of big tech vis-a-vis all people who work, okay? That they came up with the ideas, right? As Kristina mentioned, previous Democratic administrations in the United States actually brought the heads of big tech corporations into the US Trade Representative, the Trade Ministry, and asked them to come up with what their proposals were for a digital trade agreement, which they then called e-commerce. And so these proposals come from them, and that's why they're intended to increase their power and profit. The proposed bans on regulating cross-border data transfer. Okay, Kristina mentioned this. This is one of the big core trade agreement aspects of it. They want to ban regulation of cross-border data transfers so that you cannot keep data in your own country that you produce in your own country. You can't use it in your own country. You can't prevent it from leaving your country. These are intended partially to constrain policies to foment job creation. If data and digitalization is the economic engine of the future, how is a country going to set policies for digital industrialization if they don't have access to the data that their own people produce? Okay, that's the raw materials we're talking about. The intention is to stop digital industrialization and to make sure that all of the economic benefits go to the big corporations through their monopoly power. A third way is that the proposed bans on requiring firms to have a local presence would diminish the rule of labor law. So there's another provision in addition to banning regulations of cross-border data transfer. They also talk about you cannot require a corporation to have a legal local presence to be able to operate in your country. Imagine. So I, as a US big tech corporation, want to be able to operate in Argentina, but Argentina won't have the right to require that I have a local presence. Now I hire some people or I provide some goods and services and there's been consumer fraud or I exploit the workers. Well, sorry, you don't have a local office to go to reivindicate your rights. That's the intention of not having a local presence. They say that its intention is to make it cheaper for businesses, but part of the intention is also to make it so that rule of law doesn't have to apply. There's also, in terms of the proposed bans on regulation of cross-border data transfers, this would also constrain people's rights and privacy, including workers' privacy over their data. Okay, and that's a really important consideration. The bans on source code disclosure would also make enforcing labor rights more difficult. Okay, now this happens all the time where AI is used to hire workers, to fire workers, to give workers promotions, to sanction workers for whatever harm that they've done. And if they say, well, this is the AI is based on source code. That's what I mean. It's written. The instructions are in the source code. And then they say, well, the source code is actually this black box and it's proprietary and you can't look at it because we said in the trade agreement that there's a ban on government's ability to require the disclosure of source code. So sorry, worker, you're not allowed to know why you got fired. Sorry, worker, you're not allowed to know why so-and-so got a promotion and you got dismissed because it's proprietary information. Now, this is happening all the time. Okay, this is not a crazy example. The provisions to expand market access rights for digital firms. I mentioned the market access at the beginning, right? That countries want, corporations, excuse me, want to have the right to market access. Now, this would make it, for digital firms, this would increase privatization of public services, okay? So if you have, for example, a bid on who's going to manage the data of, say, the brilliant example that was put in the chat, the postal system, you might say, well, our postal system is a public institution. But if there's a private corporation managing the data, that's a partial privatization of the postal system, even if the system is public still, right? And that means all those workers are not public service workers. It means that there's much less accountability. And they can, again, claim that the source code is private. They can claim that the data is private, So that's why these things need to be stayed in public hands. Now, there's also provisions to ban development strategies. So developing countries have historically used a number of strategies when they allow foreign corporations to come in and operate in their countries. These are called performance requirements in the development literature. And there are things like requiring that if a foreign corporation is operating in your country, you have to have locals on the local board, you have to use local inputs, you have to use a certain percentage of local workers. You have to engage in technology transfer. These are sort of normal bread and butter performance requirements that allow countries to ensure that they have an economic benefit for foreign corporations operating in their country. And these would also be, are proposed to be banned in a lot of the digital trade agreements. And this would especially harm workers in developing countries. Now, there's also, I think we've seen through a number of the different rules that we've mentioned, the data transfers, the local presence requirement, the ban on localization of data. This would really greatly constrain the ability of all countries, but especially developing countries, to foment digital industrialization. And so if you're not going to be able to use digitalization to create more jobs in the future, you know, where does that leave you in terms of job creation? And it's important to understand this is by design. This is a feature of the digital trade agreements. It's not a bug that, oops, you know, every year digital grows and grows and grows. And if you look at the employment statistics of these same corporations, they're pretty flat. Like, they're not employing more and more workers. Digitalization is intended to increase productivity and therefore to reduce the amount of workers that are needed. The proposals also, it's important to understand that they fail to address specific issues for workers of platformization, okay, including the right to organize. And why is that? Well, I think it's obvious by this point. The proposals incorporate zero demands from labor unions. Okay, labor unions have been very active in the last decade in making proposals for how to make digitalization more fair, more transparent, more job promoting, more, you know, giving workers more and more access to technology. None of those provisions are included in the digital trade agreements as we know. So there's a lot of reasons why these are very, very, very anti-worker. Now, let me just mention a couple of the ones why they're very, very anti-democratic as well.
Deborah,
And they affect.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm watching my time. Yeah. So there are proposals called transparency proposals, okay? And they would actually increase the role of corporations in the regulatory process. So say you have an online financial safety for minors rule, boom, big tech is going to, now you would be obligated to tell big tech what your new proposed rule is that would affect them. And you would have an obligation to set up a mechanism by which they could tell you as a government what they think you should do in order to have this regulation to achieve this objective, okay? So this would actually increase the role of corporations. They would also lock in deregulation and limit government's ability to react to changes in the economy. Kristina mentioned, we are regulating for problems that we know of now, but we are seeing that in technology, we get new problems every day that no government has ever heard of, and we need to have that kind of policy space to be able to move. The proposed unregulated free data flows have led to a dramatic increase in mis and disinformation. They have deformed electoral campaigns, great harm to our democracies. And what are we able to do about it now? Not nearly enough, okay? There's also the issue that these proposed bans on source disclosure would make regulating digital bias more difficult. So, for example, police forces and judiciary systems are using predictive sentencing. So who is more likely to be a recidivist? Okay, there's a lot of examples why we need to be able to regulate source code, because this is how all businesses are making decisions in the future, right? The more and more decisions they put into AI, that's based on source code. And then they say, oh, you can't look at the source code because that's proprietary. So there's a lot of other reasons. I'm not going to get into too many of them because my time is getting short, but I need to point out that one of the most important proposed rules would allow big tech to profit from harmful, dangerous online activity that is often prohibited in the analog world, okay? So we have a situation in which we saw what happened with Cambridge Analytica. We have all kinds of disinformation fomenting violence. We have a massive explosion of images and videos of online child sexual abuse that has happened in the last 5 or 10 years. Absolutely unprecedented. And what happens is that these firms now are saying, oh, but I'm just a platform. It's these third parties that you have to go after. But they're using the platform and it's their business model to profit from this activity, okay? If it's disinformation or if it's actually illegal activity. Sometimes these illegal activities are illegal in the analog world, but they're actually allowed, or the enforcement is not happening in the digital world, okay? So this is very problematic. We need more ability to regulate all these different sectors and not to have them prohibited. There's also 7 different ways, I'm not going to get into them, that the big tech has put in these provisions in order to do tax evasion. And that's both to evade tariffs, direct taxes on trade and digital goods, but it's also for them to be able to consolidate their tax evasion strategies generally. So I hope that that gives you some of the impacts of the big ones, the bans on cross-border data transfer and the bans on data localization and the bans on source code disclosure, but also some of the other important provisions that we've seen in their negative impact, I have yet to come up with a compelling reason of why the public interest would benefit from any of these digital trade rules as they have been proposed. We can go into what those rules would be later. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Deborah. It's really gloomy, but there's always a way to struggle and fight back. So we'll get to that on week 6 when we look at alternatives, and also here in this conversation maybe later. But now to you, Vahini, I want to know, like, we all wonder why states keep negotiating these horrible rules. What is going on? Why some countries accept this? And so we wanted to know, and we wanted to ask you, what are the pressures that states face to negotiate this agenda? Do they really understand what is at stake? Can you tell us a little bit about your own experience being a negotiator in this rulemaking that we are seeing? You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you.
That doesn't happen, so don't worry.
Thank you. Just to confirm, you can see my screen? Yep. Okay, great. So I think there's a number of ways in which these pressures and power disparities are manifesting. And, it's obviously coming very strongly through policy environments, but also obviously through trade negotiation settings. So the first one, which I had briefly touched upon earlier, relates to negotiation capacity. And so what we've noticed, or it's really, really, quite evident that those who have the financial and human resources to invest in massive research, and have very large specialized negotiating teams are more successful than those who obviously lack the necessary capacities and the expertise. And we've seen this particularly in the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce negotiations. And just to give you an example, if you look at the number of proposals that have been tabled in the negotiations, they mostly come from developed countries, and they have a higher degree of success. One, because of the coordination and the resources that are put behind them for them to succeed and receive the needed airtime in the negotiating platforms. But also that they are being kind of managed by the chairpersons or the co-conveners or the coordinators of these negotiations, which are member states themselves. So this has been one glaring shortcoming, especially for ensuring inclusivity in the negotiations. We're also seeing, a new dynamic, which I had also mentioned earlier, becoming very entrenched, and that is becoming entrenched in big technology firms' operations, and that particularly relates to their progressive involvement and the significant investment into academic and policy research. And it's taking a few forms, through funding research in other institutions and think tanks, including major academic, US Ivy League schools, for example, where this massive kind of propaganda is being used to advance certain claims and certain interests by big tech. And we're also seeing it through research and development funding conducted by the big tech firms themselves. And I had mentioned this as well, that in the AI domain, this is increasingly showing up. The next point relates to knowledge production and access to information. So we are observing that, policy development in the global north is essentially setting the agenda across globally, and it's providing the framework within which trade policies are being debated, formulated, and implemented in international trade settings. And so Deborah had mentioned this about the templates that were already developed by the big tech lobbyists, and these have been used in digital trade agreements globally. And this was set as far back as 2011 in the WTO, where the US and the EU, through a very innocuous submission, had made a proposal for trade-related principles that were designed to support the expansion of ICT networks and services. And soon it just expanded, or the narrative and the agenda expanded to start talking about exploratory discussions, launching a joint statement initiative, creating a group that they called Friends of E-commerce for Development. And now we're in a situation where there is an actual substantive, close to finalization negotiating text, which had started out through a very long, coordinated and orchestrated process in the WTO. Another interesting and very concerning dynamic is what's happening in the African continental FTA negotiations. So the actual text, which is known as the Digital Trade Protocol, has been adopted a few weeks ago. And what's contained in this text is actually the exact same provisions that is of interest to the US big tech corporate lobbyists. And there are at least 7 provisions in the text that was adopted a few weeks ago that clearly address this, that address US interests and pays very little attention to African interests. And an important piece was written by Afronomics Law, where they had basically said that what's being proposed in the African context is simply not fit for Africa. So this is just giving you a bit of some insights into how the influences are taking shape also in continents without unfortunately, much concern from some of the member governments. Another concerning kind of dynamic is the influence that we are seeing on rulemaking. And I think what I've already mentioned is really interlinked with my next, 2 points. And that relates to the power and the political influence that developed countries as well as their firms have in setting the agenda and framing the rules. And clearly, as has been explained by the previous speakers, we're seeing that the creation of these rules are simply there to serve the interests of a handful of members or of countries in the global north, and it is marginalizing the interests and concerns of the global south. And the African Continental FTA is a glaring example of this. But more importantly is the concerning development with respect to implementation capabilities. So even, when agreements are being reached, we are seeing that the capacity to implement and enforce rules they vary, and they are quite different for both developed and developing countries. And, this is not only limited to digital trade, but across pretty much all trade issues that are being negotiated in the WTO, we are essentially seeing that the kinds of rules that are being proposed are those in which developed countries can easily adjust to, or that simply maintain the status quo for them, meaning that very little substantive reforms and changes are needed in their laws. And so developing countries, on the other hand, struggle because they have to undertake substantial reforms. And we are seeing this, for example, in the fisheries subsidies negotiations and the SNDT negotiations in the WTO. I also wanted to share an interesting kind of dynamic that's been happening recently. So as soon as the US TR had made the decision to withdraw support for some of the very problematic proposals on data flows, on data localization, on source code disclosure, and others, we had seen how quickly the chairpersons of the JSI on e-commerce negotiations had actually changed the text to accommodate the US. So a lot of the provisions were actually removed and substantively changed to basically make the US very happy and, to placate their interests to stay on in the negotiations. But for example, when Nigeria had proposed a carve-out on data flows and Cote d'Ivoire had proposed that the implementation of rules should only be done once countries have acquired the necessary capabilities to implement the agreement, these were completely rejected. And in fact, Nigeria's submission didn't even get any airtime in the negotiations. So this is obviously also displaying the unprocedural and untransparent and uninclusive ways in which some of these negotiations are taking place and are being handled. You know, related to this notion of implementation capacities is also the idea that, and Deborah touched on it with respect to enhanced transparency and how it is giving much greater powers to the private sector to influence laws and regulations in our countries. And in the WTO, we're seeing much more emphasis on these kinds of surveillance types of agreements and provisions in which enhanced transparency, prior comment, monitoring, and evaluation are considered. And so one example that I could give you is, you know, in the fishery subsidies negotiations and export restrictions, for example, there are massive interests that are trying to enhance transparency in this area. Exact same thing we're seeing in e-commerce as well. And so there's a bit of, you know, divergences amongst how to approach it. And so this is clearly going to be an issue in which surveillance kinds of provisions are going to be looked at more closely, in particular by developing countries who are normally on the back foot in terms of implementing and complying with agreements, but also that they have to be ready to respond to any inquiries coming from developed countries. I'm just going to move to my next slide. So my next slide is pretty much a continuation, and this relates to some of the dynamics that relate to pressure and retaliation that we're seeing kind of manifest in the negotiating dynamics. So, for example, you know, developed countries have more leverage, of course, to pressurize and retaliate against countries that want to regulate the digital economy. And this is primarily done through trade sanctions or, you know, in the context of Africa, for example, the moment an African country wants to do something, the US threatens them with removing their trade preferences with respect to market access. And some examples include, you know, Brazil and Indonesia on digital services taxes. So when they had expressed an intention to introduce legislation on digital services taxes, the US government instituted Section 301 investigations, arguing that the taxes would actually be discriminatory on US companies. In South Africa, for example, they, the Ministry of Communications and Digital Technologies was developing a data and cloud policy. And you know, it was quite a progressive, very pro-development, pro-industrialization approach to data sovereignty and cloud policy. And they had received so much of backlash and so many comments. They were flooded with comments from the private sector and foreign governments that they actually had to put the draft policy on the back burner. So it's also showing you how even in the absence of certain rules, how the influence and the pressures are also shaping policy development in developing countries. Another factor that I also wanted to elaborate on is the notion of the involvement of foreign governments and foreign firms in bilateral and regional processes and negotiations. So we are seeing increasing evidence of developed countries' involvement in agreements that are taking place across other developing countries through bilateral or RTAs with developing countries. And they're basically being used to pressure countries to adopt certain positions. And one very concerning development has been that in the African continental negotiations on the digital trade protocol, for example, the US government is on record saying that they have invested $160 million into the actual negotiation on digital trade and investment protocols. Yes, in the AfCFTA. And this clearly shows you a major, major conflict of interest. And I would urge, you know, everybody to have a look at the leaked text that is on bilaterals.org, which essentially will give you a sense of the kinds of rules that are being proposed, the interest behind it. And, you know, you clearly see that this is, as has been argued, not fit for Africa. Another important dynamic that we're also seeing, and I'm sorry, I'm only focusing on Africa, but there's just so many interesting and very recent examples of what's really happening. And so there is also, a very deliberate attempt to ensure that African countries do not actually integrate. The entire purpose of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was that they would build up and enhance intra-African trade, that they would develop an African digital industrialization. And basically, it was looking at a very inclusive way for Africa to develop according to Agenda 2063. And a few years ago, the heads of state in Africa, in the African Union, had agreed that state parties should be, it was very, political language. And they basically said that state parties should be, encouraged not to enter into FTAs with outside parties, in trade negotiations. But shortly after that, the US had decided that they want to launch negotiations with Kenya in an FTA. And to date, we have a number of examples. We have also the UK wanting to negotiate an economic partnership agreement with Kenya. We see the EU wanting to update their economic partnership agreement with Kenya. We're seeing the same thing with Ghana and the UK, Cameroon and the EU, Cote d'Ivoire and the EU, Rwanda and the EU. So this just gives you a sense of, how do you integrate if there are these constant, as you mentioned, Sofia, spaghetti bowl of rules and interferences that are obviously impacting one's ability to integrate, but also to trade with each other, because then the notions of trade rules, non-discriminatory treatment, MFN, etc., come into play. And finally, on this point, I just wanted to also point out that an important dynamic of what's happening either in bilateral agreements or, as I mentioned, in the African Continental FTA process is that the rules that are being negotiated, outside of the WTO are also going to jeopardize countries' positions in the WTO. For example, African countries have now agreed to this very ambitious agreement, amongst themselves, and that will now be the basis for their positions in the WTO. So it will be very difficult for them to say, well, I don't want to agree to cross-border data flows, but the US will say, well, you were happy to agree to it in the African context. So what stops you from agreeing to it in the WTO? And I think in the context of the customs duties moratorium, this would play out spectacularly bad, I think, for African countries in which the notion that you can agree to a moratorium in the African context will really cause some kind of difficulties from both a policy but also a trade negotiating perspective for African countries in the WTO.
But we need to wrap up because we are running out of time.
Yes. Okay. And finally, on special and differential treatment. So basically, this is a standard provision in the WTO. And it is an embedded right in the WTO that basically means that it is a recognition that developing and least developed countries are at a different level of development than developed countries. And so they require certain flexibilities within the system and within trade rules. And so interestingly and very problematically, we're seeing within the WTO framework, not only is the notion of special and differential treatment being challenged, but also in these new age agreements, we're seeing very, very ineffective provisions on special and differential treatment, very weak provisions on technical assistance and capacity building. There are very weak development exceptions, or SNDT provisions in the JSI on e-commerce, but also in the African Continental FTA, for example. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Vahini. Well, I have a lot of questions and I have prepared some questions that I wanted to ask you, but it would be so unfair for our participants if we didn't pick at least one question that they have raised. So Pia, could you please give us one question so they can shortly answer or react to it?
Yeah, there were many questions and I think everything is interesting. Some of them were already developed during the session, but I think that what's absorbing most of the questions on the Q&A is why these power disparities? Why these trade agreements not benefit not only developing countries, but not also the citizenship? Why always corporate before the citizens? Why developed countries before developing countries? Why? That is the main thing that was raised. Do you have any further thoughts on that matter?
That's a big question, Pia. Thank you very much. So anyone wants to react shortly because we have 5 minutes?
Oh,
Christine, okay, Kristina and then Deborah.
I want to be very brief. I cannot speak to the decolonial or colonial traces of these trade agreements, but as I mentioned earlier, I have the feeling that it has a lot to do with the way how trade agreements are made, this kind of seclusive negotiations where there is no exposure to dissent and there's a it is not inclusive, the representation of interest. In such an environment, a certain mindset can like reproduce itself, and these people are for them trade law is their profession, it's their identity, and they think a bit differently. I don't think they are necessarily bad people, but they have like overconfidence, for example, into the ability of the general exceptions to deliver relief in the case there is a conflict and to exempt certain domestic regulations that are conflicting with trade law rules. This overconfidence is one thing, and then there is another thing which has to do, of course, with different societal and economic concepts that are leading. And especially the US, as we know, is very liberal, is less regulated and less has a different way of governing its economy, where there is the free market is everything. And in a way, this mindset, that this is going to solve, that trade will just improve everything, is then exported. Whereas other countries actually see then also the disadvantages of it. So there's more to say, but I want to say that one of the most successful ways to challenge digital trade law is to demand transparency and inclusivity of the negotiations, and don't anymore let that happen behind closed doors among very few privileged people, and that I, as a researcher, have to go to bilaterals.org to see the leaked draft text of an agreement to actually assess and engage with it.
Thank you, Kristina. Deborah, you wanted to jump in and you left us with a whole bunch of alternatives, information in the chat box, which I think it's wonderful.
yes, I think, when we talk about how this is captured, we have to think about the fact that the biggest members of the business lobbies in all of the countries around the world are the branch of your country of American big tech. Okay, so big tech corporations dominate the EU business lobbies on technology. Okay, it's like Google Europe, Amazon Europe, Facebook Europe. Big tech spends a ton of money in all countries lobbying, and there was a lot of great documentation of this by Public Citizen in the US, by Corporate Europe Observatory. They spend this money because it works. It's an investment in rigging the rules in their favor. They have even been caught making fake MSME associations so the trade negotiators can pretend and act like they're doing this for MSMEs. And like Kristina said, a lot of the people who work in these trade negotiating ministries are just bought in by the rhetoric of the model. They don't look at the evidence. They say, well, this is intended to increase trade, and they don't ever go back and look at whether or not it's actually damaging to democracy, damaging to MSMEs, damaging to workers. And if it is, they say, well, that's not the trade agreement, it's not our fault. So also, the thing that Vahini mentioned, we have in the US, USAID, that actually spends tons of money. All of our development agencies, the Swedish, the German, the UK, everybody's is spending millions and millions of dollars on training trade negotiators in developing countries to negotiate according to provisions that are beneficial for US big tech. So these are all very pernicious reasons why the business elite has actually captured the regulatory. But I put in the chat some things we can fight for, but I wonder if I could just say one sentence about what we can do, Sofia, because I don't want to leave people without any hope.
No, we always want to leave with a positive message. So just
That's
go
right.
ahead shortly.
That's right. So I need to tell you guys, we can do this, okay? Because we, as Our World Is Not for Sale, worked with Public Services International for many years to stop the Trade and Services Agreement. The reason you don't know what the TISA is because we stopped it. And it was some of the research, actually, that Professor Irion had did on privacy and the way that these trade agreements don't allow proper regulation that enabled us to help stop that trade agreement. In 2017 in Buenos Aires, there was a huge fight. Big tech was trying to get a multilateral mandate in the World Trade Organization to negotiate a digital trade agreement. And Vahini was actually one of the key African negotiators who stopped that. We owe her a huge debt. We would all be facing a multilateral trade agreement that might have already been concluded had the African group not put his foot down, okay? So there are a lot of governments right now, dozens and dozens, that are part of the digital trade agreement of the JSI. If your country is part of it, you need to work to get them out. They should not be. It's bad. It's not in your interest. Whether you're from a North country or a South country or in between, it doesn't matter. Tell them you want them to get out. If your country is not part of it, tell them to stay out because they are pressuring countries every day to join. There's also a number of bilateral agreements that were mentioned. If your country is negotiating one of these bilateral agreements, first of all, get them not to begin with. But second of all, make sure that the digital trade provisions are not part of that agreement. Okay, these are things we can discuss how to do, but that's the basic framework. If they're participating, get them out. If they're not participating, keep them out. And we can do all kinds of organizing work to make that happen, including media work and everything else. And one of the aspects that I think is the most important is to work with the tax justice community. Many of you are tax justice advocates. You know that digital is some of the worst corporations for tax evading, and they have so many different ways of doing it. So let's build and connect with some of these movements to say, we don't want our future world to be run by big tech corporations. We want to have democracies where we have nationally developed political participation and democratically developed rules on all of these different issues. And we cannot do that if we allow our governments to be hijacked and allow a digital trade agreement to come through and put handcuffs on all of this regulation of the digital sector in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And it's true, Vahini, now to you to close. You are a light of hope because you were capable of stopping some of these agreements. And so it means that we can if we inform ourselves, we unite, we do solidarity, we struggle all together. So Vahini, to you, so we close with your words.
Thank you. I mean, I just have to say that we need to pay attention to process. I've seen how important process has been in, the global north achieving what they have. And this is throughout the entire history of the WTO and, during the GATT days. So, of course, I think it's really important that we insist on inclusivity. But also there needs to be a much deeper understanding at the government levels, amongst civil society, amongst all relevant stakeholders, that a one-size-fits-all approach is actually not the solution. It's clear, from the way in which the digital economy has unraveled and developed in different economies. And so, the notion that trade agreements is the vehicle to solve, digital inclusion, the way we're seeing it, this is clearly not the case. And I think it's really pertinent from a policy, a negotiating, and also a development perspective that we basically refocus and shift our attention to ensuring that the digital economy is focused on equitable development and predicated on digital industrialization. You cannot become an industrialized country, without it. And so this is very fundamental if we want to get on the right development path and build our economies and ensure that, there can be a legitimate right to participate and engage in the digital economy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vahini. I see some concerns in the chat about not being able to copy or the links. We always download everything. We send the weekly digest with all the most important information. And you have seen in the masterclass how we put the links and also the presentations whenever the speaker sent this to us. So all information will be there. So to end up this session, thank you so very much to our guests, Vahini, Kristina, and Deborah. You have been amazing. Thank you all as well for the whole TNI team for a great organization support. A round of applause. This has been our 4th masterclass. Next week, the theme of our course will be digitalization and the security state. This session will talk about another concern that has been raised throughout the course. We are truly living in a dangerous world where wars is in everyday news and where it is increasingly waged through algorithms. More and more surveillance technologies are used not just to promote war, but also target the most vulnerable and to target activists such as us who are fighting for a more just world. We can address digital capitalism without looking at the mechanisms by which it is being enforced, sometimes through violence. So we hope that you will join us on this masterclass. On Monday, the module will be open on our course website with lots of great educational resources to read and learn from. Then on Thursday, please note that it will be a Thursday, not a Wednesday. At the same time, Thursday, 2nd of May, at the same time as today, we'll be joined in our masterclass by Ben Hayes. He is a TNI associate and founding director of AWO, a data rights agency. He has collaborated with TNI since the late 2000s on issues related to international security, counterterrorism, surveillance, human rights, civil liberties, and civic space. We also are joined by Petra Molnar, a lawyer and anthropologist specializing in migration and human rights. She has been working on migrant justice since 2008, first as a settlement worker and community organizer, and now as a researcher and lawyer. She specializes in digital border technologies and runs Migration Tech Monitor that tracks surveillance technologies and its impacts on those who are on the move. Finally, we are joined by Marna Fatafta. She leads Access Now policy and advocate work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, and will share about Israel's pivotal global role in the digitization of oppression and violence that we have seen so brutally in Gaza, but also uses technologies and practice that are exported worldwide. So please notice that next week's masterclass will be on Thursday, May the 2nd. In other words, it will not be on a Wednesday, since Wednesday is the 1st of May, Workers' Day around the world, a day to remember the working class struggle and the importance of us being together to counterbalance corporate power. Thank you once again for joining us. Please take one quick minute to fill in the poll on your screens, as it will help us evaluate this session. We will also leave the chat open for a few minutes so you can wrap up the conversations there. And again, any suggestions for improvement, do not hesitate to mail us at digitalcapitalism@tni.org. Thank you so very much for being here with us. Thank you, Kristina. Thank you, Vahini. And thank you, Deborah, for joining us and being so generous with your time. And see you, everybody, in next week's masterclass.